The story most people know about the 2026 Iran war goes like this. The United States and Israel attacked Iran. Iran retaliated across the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz closed. Oil prices spiked. And the world watched to see how it ended. That story is true. It is also incomplete in a way that matters enormously for understanding what is actually happening to the broader Islamic world right now. Because on the same day, Operation Epic Fury launched, February 28, 2026, two Muslim-majority countries were already at war with each other. Pakistan had already declared open war on the Taliban-governed Afghanistan. Pakistani forces were already holding 32 square kilometers of Afghan territory in the southern Zob sector. Afghan Taliban forces had already deployed anti-aircraft systems around Bagram Air Base. Explosions were already audible in Kabul. The Iran war did not create this conflict. It landed on top of one that was already burning. And the collision between what was happening in Tehran and what was happening in Peshawar, Karachi, Gilgit, Kabul, and Islamabad simultaneously produced something that no single headline fully captured. The fracturing of the Muslim world's response to a war that many of its citizens experienced as an attack on their religion, their identity, and their leadership, while their governments calculated something entirely different. The war. Nobody was watching. To understand why the Muslim world's response to the Iran war is so fractured, you need to understand what was already happening between Pakistan and Afghanistan before February 28th. The Afghanistan-Pakistan border has been one of the world's most contested frontiers for decades. The Durand Line, drawn by a British colonial administrator in 1893, never accepted by any Afghan government, divides the Pashtun people between two states that have never agreed on where their border actually is. The Taliban who govern Afghanistan have deep roots in Pakistani Pashtun networks. Pakistan helped create the Taliban in the 1990s. And now Pakistan and the Taliban are at war. The immediate trigger in 2026 was Pakistani airstrikes on what Islamabad described as militant camps inside Afghanistan. Bases for groups including the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban, who have been conducting attacks inside Pakistan since their expulsion from the country. Afghanistan retaliated. Pakistan declared open war. By the time Operation Epic Fury launched, Pakistani forces were occupying Afghan territory. Pakistani jets were entering Afghan airspace, and Taliban forces were firing anti-aircraft weapons at Pakistani military aircraft over Kabul. This conflict, two nuclear threshold states. In the case of Pakistan, one of them, the world's only Muslim-majority nuclear power, received almost no international diplomatic attention because every diplomat with any capacity to mediate was consumed by the Iran crisis. Former Afghan diplomat Omar Samad stated it plainly. The involvement of the United States and Israel in the Middle East is a much larger, more important, significant event, and it is taking away bandwidth from anything else happening across the world, including in the neighborhood of Pakistan, Afghanistan. The wars were happening simultaneously. One was receiving the full weight of international attention. One was left to continue without urgent international intervention. Pakistan burns from the inside. On March 1st, 2026, one day after Operation Epic Fury launched, Pakistan fractured internally in a way that its government had not anticipated and could not contain with its existing security posture. The trigger was the confirmation of Ali Khamenei's death. For Shia Muslims, who constitute approximately 15 to 20% of Pakistan's 250 million people, Khamenei was not merely the political leader of a foreign state. He was the supreme religious authority of the global Shia community, a figure of spiritual significance whose violent killing by an American and Israeli military operation was experienced as a direct attack on their faith and their identity. Within hours of the confirmation, protests erupted across Pakistan. In Karachi, which has one of the largest Shia populations of any city in the world, thousands of demonstrators moved toward the U.S. Consulate. The protests turned violent. The outer wall of the consulate was breached. Police responded with tear gas and live fire. At least 10 people were killed outside the consulate alone. The Marine security guards also opened fire, with reports of up to 16 dead at that location. Windows were smashed. Attempts were made to burn the building. In Islamabad, a Shia march toward the U.S. embassy was met by security forces. One person was killed in those clashes. The Pakistani government deployed military units to secure diplomatic facilities across multiple cities. In the northern Gilgit-Baltistan region, where Shia Muslims form a majority in some districts, the situation was more severe. Thousands of demonstrators attacked the offices of the UN Military Observer Group, which monitors the ceasefire in disputed Kashmir. They attacked the UN Development Program offices. They burned a police station. A school was damaged. A local charity's offices were destroyed. The Pakistani army deployed. A 3-day curfew was imposed across Gilgit, Skardu, and Shigar districts. At least 24 people were killed nationwide. More than 120 were injured. The protests were the most violent expression of sectarian sentiment Pakistan had seen in years. not directed against Iran, but directed against the United States and Israel for killing the Shia world's supreme religious authority. The Pakistani government's position was contradictory in a way that revealed the impossible geometry of its strategic situation. Islamabad had formally condemned the initiation of unwarranted attacks against Iran at the UN Security Council, expressing solidarity with brotherly Gulf countries who had been attacked. The Pakistani delegate expressed sorrow about the death of a Pakistani national in the UAE from Iranian strikes. Pakistan was simultaneously condemning the war and mourning its victims on both sides. That is not hypocrisy. It is the authentic expression of a state trapped between a Sunni majority government with strong ties to the Gulf states that the U.S. needed for its operation, a Shia minority that constituted a significant domestic political force, a deep Islamic identity that made the killing of a Muslim head of state by a Western Israeli coalition politically explosive, and strategic dependencies on the United States that the government could not publicly abandon. Pakistan's government was trying to face in 4 directions simultaneously. Its streets were telling it that was not possible. The Afghan dimension, tacit alliances, and impossible geometry. Afghanistan's Taliban government occupied one of the most peculiar positions in the entire regional response to the Iran war. The Taliban are Sunni. Iran and the Taliban have had tense relations for decades. Religious difference, the water dispute over the Helmand River, competing interests in Afghan politics going back to the 1990s. The Taliban govern a country that shares a long border with Iran. Iranian influence in Afghanistan has always been contested, and yet when Operation Epic Fury launched, the Taliban publicly condemned the strikes and expressed support for Iran. Taliban spokesman Abdul Kahar Balki posted on social media condemning the attacks and urging all parties to address differences through diplomacy. This was not enthusiasm for the Islamic Republic. It was the logic of shared adversaries. The Wire's analysis identified the coalition structure that was forming on the ground. The US, Israel, the UAE, India, and even elements supporting Afghanistan's opposition to the Taliban were effectively aligned on one side. Iran, Russia, and the Taliban, however strange that coalition appeared on paper, found themselves on the same side of the fundamental question of US-Israeli military intervention in the Muslim world. Christophe Jaffrelot of Sciences Po put the regional geometry directly. 2 coalitions were emerging, one centered on US-Israel, UAE, India, the other on Iran, Russia, Taliban. Pakistan was trying to navigate between them while simultaneously fighting. One member of the second coalition, the Taliban, across its own border. The Pakistan-Afghanistan war complicated the Iran war in a specific operational way. Pakistan's government was simultaneously concerned about Shia protests in Karachi, Taliban military operations on its western border, potential Indian military moves on its eastern border, and the risk that the Iran war would create spillover instability in Balochistan, the province that borders both Iran and Afghanistan, that contains the strategically vital Gwadar port, and that hosts significant Baloch separatist activity. Trump's February 28th statement calling on Iranian minorities to rise up against the regime, specifically naming the Baloch, added a dimension to Pakistan's security calculus that its government had not modeled. The Baloch people are also present in Pakistan and Afghanistan. A U.S. call for Baloch uprising in Iran was simultaneously a message that resonated with Baloch separatist movements on the Pakistani side of the border. Pakistan launched Operation Muhafiz-ul-Bahar, Protector of the Seas, deploying its navy to secure the Makran coast, protect Karachi and Gwadar from spillover conflict from the Strait of Hormuz crisis, escort merchant vessels, and maintain the China-Pakistan economic corridor infrastructure that represents Pakistan's most significant economic strategic asset. The CPEC runs through Gwadar. Gwadar is on the Arabian Sea, adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz. The war's economic consequences were literally arriving on Pakistan's coastline. The Gulf states, the allies, Iran called betrayers. Iran's President Pezeshkian said something in the opening days of the war that the Gulf states are still processing. Iran, he said, had no choice but to target other Muslim countries, because the US and Israel are exploiting their territory to commit crimes against Iran. He also apologized to neighboring countries for the strikes, attributing them to miscommunication in the ranks, and promising to suspend them as long as those countries did not allow attacks to originate from their territory. Both statements are true simultaneously, which makes the Gulf states' position the most strategically uncomfortable of any in the Islamic world. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait are the countries that host the U.S. bases from which Operation Epic Fury was launched and sustained. They are the countries that Iran struck in retaliation, whose airports were targeted, whose energy infrastructure was attacked, whose capitals heard air raid sirens for the first time in their modern history. They are also the countries whose oil revenues depend on the Strait of Hormuz remaining open, and whose governments have condemned Iranian retaliatory strikes as violations of their sovereignty. But Saudi Arabia is also the country that, according to the Washington Post, had Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman conducting multiple phone calls with Trump urging him to attack Iran. It is the country that normalized relations with Iran in 2023, and then, 2 years later, was hosting the bases for the war against it. The Saudi contradiction, normalizing with Iran while lobbying Washington to destroy it, is the most visible expression of the contradictions that define the Gulf states' position in this conflict. The head of Saudi Arabia's state oil company warned that continued war would yield drastic effects on the world economy. The strait closure was hurting Saudi Aramco's ability to export. Kuwait cut production because storage was filling up. Iraq was shutting down oil fields for the same reason. The Gulf states that had encouraged or facilitated the war were now absorbing its economic consequences most directly. None of them have publicly called for a ceasefire that would constrain Israel. None of them have withdrawn cooperation with the U.S. military presence. All of them are absorbing Iranian strikes on their own territory while simultaneously hosting the forces that are conducting the strikes that produce Iranian retaliation. Iran's charge that these governments betrayed their Muslim obligations by facilitating the killing of a Muslim head of state resonates in their populations, even if it does not reach official policy. The Arab Street and the Arab government have rarely been more visibly disconnected than in March 2026. Turkey, Indonesia, Malaysia, Egypt. The middle ground. The majority of the world's 1.8 billion Muslims live in countries that are neither Gulf states, nor Pakistan, nor Afghanistan. Their government's responses have been more cautious, but no less revealing of the fractures in any notion of unified Muslim response. Turkey condemned the strikes. President Erdogan had met with Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi in the weeks before the war began. Turkey was one of the countries working to arrange diplomatic channels. Spain's refusal to allow U.S. forces use of Spanish bases, a NATO member refusing Washington on a war authorization question, found parallel sentiment in Turkey's position, where the government denied that NATO AWACS surveillance flights were being used to support the strikes after Bloomberg reported that they were operating from Konya Airport. Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim-majority country, saw civil groups protesting outside the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta. Indonesian protesters called on the government to leave what they described as the U.S.-formed Board of Peace, the regional normalization framework. The Indonesian government maintained formal diplomatic neutrality while its population expressed something more visceral. Malaysia, whose government has historically been among the most vocal in the Muslim world on Palestinian rights and U.S.-Israel policy, echoed similar condemnations. Egypt, whose government maintains close U.S. military and financial ties, called for restraint without condemning the strikes. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the 57-member body that is supposed to represent the collective voice of the Muslim world, issued a statement calling for de-escalation. It did not condemn the U.S.-Israeli strikes. It did not endorse them. It produced the diplomatic language of an institution that contains both countries, that facilitated the war and countries that would have opposed it if asked. The Muslim world's institutional response to the Iran war was, essentially, silence dressed up as diplomacy. The sectarian layer that everyone avoids. There's a dimension of the Muslim world's response to the Iran war that most official analysis carefully avoids naming directly. It is the Sunni-Shia divide, and its influence on how the Islamic world's 1.8 billion Muslims experience this war is not uniform, not simple, and not reducible to a single narrative. Iran is Shia. The Islamic Republic was founded on a specifically Shia revolutionary theology. The IRGC and the Quds Force operate through specifically Shia proxy networks. Hezbollah, the Houthis, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. The supreme leader killed in Operation Epic Fury was the supreme religious authority of global Shia Islam. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, are ruled by Sunni governments, some of which have Shia minority populations that they have historically suppressed. Saudi Arabia's conflict with Iran has deep sectarian roots that economic competition and geopolitical rivalry have built upon rather than replaced. The Arab states that facilitated this war were not religiously neutral actors. They were Sunni governments that had every domestic political reason to see the Shia revolutionary state weakened. The protests in Pakistan were primarily Shia protests. The regions that exploded, Gilgit-Baltistan, Karachi's Shia neighborhoods, are precisely the regions with large Shia populations. The sectarian geography of the protests maps almost exactly onto the sectarian geography of Pakistani Islam. This does not mean that only Shia Muslims oppose the war. Sunni opposition to U.S. military action in Muslim countries runs deep across the entire spectrum. But the specific intensity of the violence, the specific targeting of U.S. diplomatic facilities, and the specific character of the grief that drove it were shaped by Shia identity in ways that a general Muslim solidarity framing obscures. The Pakistan that is simultaneously fighting the Taliban, a Sunni extremist movement, and suppressing Shia protests over the killing of the Shia supreme leader is a country in which every dimension of Islamic identity is under acute pressure simultaneously. That is not instability as a temporary condition. That is instability as a structural feature of a country that contains multitudes. It cannot reconcile. In the middle of a regional war, it did not start and cannot control. What the media in Karachi and Kabul actually said. The original framing of this topic, what Afghan and Pakistani media said about the Iran war, reveals something about the information environment in these countries that Western coverage does not capture. Pakistani media operated under the immediate pressure of events too close and too dangerous to analyze at distance. Geo News and Dawn covered the protests as a domestic security crisis, army deployment, curfew orders, casualty counts, rather than as an expression of something deeper about the country's relationship to the Iran war and to U.S. foreign policy. The speed and scale of the violence made analysis difficult while the events were happening. Afghan media faced a different constraint: Taliban information control. Multiple reports documented that Taliban authorities restricted domestic media coverage of Pakistani strikes inside Afghanistan, warned against publication of images and casualty details, and conducted propaganda campaigns while suppressing independent reporting. An Afghan media outlet reported that Taliban officials in Kabul had organized anti-Pakistan protests, while residents confirmed limited public participation. The Taliban wanted media to show a unified Afghan Muslim people outraged at both Pakistan and the U.S. The actual Afghan population, exhausted by decades of war, was considerably more ambivalent. What both media environments shared was a fundamental question that their coverage circled without directly answering. In a conflict framed as Islam versus the West, who speaks for Islam? Not theologically, but practically, politically, in the world as it exists in March 2026? The answer that the events of this month suggest is nobody does. Not consistently, not across the sectarian, national, and geopolitical fractures that divide the Muslim world's 1.8 billion people into competing interests, loyalties, and identities that the word Muslim describes, but does not unify. Iran's supreme leader was killed. The Muslim world grieved in its own way. The Gulf states that helped make it possible absorbed the retaliation, Pakistan, burned from the inside while fighting a separate war from the outside. Afghanistan fought Pakistan while condemning the killing of Iran's leader. Turkey kept its distance while keeping its channels open. Indonesia protested. Egypt stayed quiet. The OIC issued a statement, and the war continued. Because in the end, Muslim solidarity in 2026 is exactly what it has always been: a genuine, emotional and religious reality for hundreds of millions of individuals, and an institutional fiction for the governments that claim to represent them. The question of whether Muslim countries are heading to war over Iran misses the more uncomfortable truth. Some of them were already there. Some of them helped start it. Some of them are being consumed by it from within. And the ones watching from a distance are calculating whether their interests require them to say something, do something, or continue the silence that has served their governments well, while their populations feel something else entirely. That calculation between what governments can afford to say and what their people feel is the real Muslim response to the Iran war. And it is not finished.